announced it today. Minneapolis County Attorney Michael Freeman and I filed a complaint that charges police officer King, Lane, and Tao with aiding and abetting murder in the second degree and felony offense.
Charges filed. All 4 ex-officers at the scene when George Floyd died have now been charged. The Minnesota State Attorney General announcing charges of aiding and abetting Derek Chauvin as he knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. We'll take a closer look at the actions and inaction of those officers. Voices of the movement.
Now that picture that y'all see with George Floyd and how big it is. That's why I want everybody to realize how big your voice is.
The father of Michael Brown speaks out about the magnitude of this moment. George Floyd's own son visits a site where his father died. The peaceful protests continue to grow nationwide, while America's major cities use curfews to try to prevent violent unrest. President Trump's fighting words. He defends his recent actions against protesters, even as some within his own administration disagree with the use of active duty troops to shut down protests in this country. Republican Senator Tim Scott is here to weigh in. And how does the president's rhetoric about the protesters compare to other movements? We'll examine in his own words. Battling COVID, concerns over potential spikes where protests have been most prevalent. Dr. Fauci talks about the latest timeline for a potential vaccine. And talking with moms, the uncomfortable conversations mothers are now having with their children and how they say they're saving lives. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. After more than a week of protests and rage, action came today. All 4 officers at the scene as George Floyd took his final breath. They've now been charged and taken into custody. And the officer whose knee pinned Floyd down, he now faces a more serious charge of second-degree murder. But the question that looms large tonight, will this satisfy protesters to the point of many deciding that it's time to go home? Or is this, as the mayor of Minneapolis said today, not just about the 8 minutes, but about the previous 400 years? We'll hear from protesters across the country tonight. But first, we begin with the new criminal charges and what this may mean for those seeking justice in the name of George Floyd. Alex Perez leads us off.
As protests spread around the world, tonight all 4 fired Minneapolis police officers now charged in connection with the death of George Floyd.
Here today because George Floyd is not here. He should be here. He should be alive, but he's not.
The state's attorney general increasing charges to second-degree murder for Derek Chauvin, the officer seen digging his knee into Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes.
Please, I can't breathe.
The other 3 officers, Tao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane, now charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder.
George Floyd mattered. He was loved. His family was important. His life had value. And we will seek justice for him and for you, and we will find it.
The complaint also says Officer Tao got a hobble restraint to bind Floyd's feet, but the officers decided not to use it and instead stayed on top of him. According to the original complaint, one of the officers said, "Should we roll him on his side?" But Chauvin didn't do that. Floyd's family attorney calling the new charges a step towards justice.
I believe this is the tipping point in America, where we finally address something they don't like to talk about.
The crowd erupting as word spread that the other officers were being charged.
All 4 officers have been charged. Yeah! We got all 4. We got all 4.
The autopsy commissioned by Floyd's family found it was a homicide by asphyxiation and that the other officers seen in this video restraining Floyd may have contributed to his death.
The weight of the other 2 police officers on his back, who not only prevented blood flow into his brain, but also airflow into his lungs.
The official medical examiner's autopsy also found it was a homicide, but pointing to cardiopulmonary arrest that was complicated by law enforcement restraint and neck compression. But family experts say it wasn't his heart, it was the pressure applied by officers. The day started with Floyd's son Quincy visiting the site.
How important is change? What do you want to see happen?
We need change. This can't happen to anybody else.
Quincy kneeling and praying where his 46-year-old father took his last breaths. Tonight, applauding the arrest.
My father had not been killed like this. We deserve justice.
And Floyd's bright-eyed 6-year-old daughter, Gianna, speaking about her father to our Eva Pilgrim.
What do you want people to know?
Kind of that I miss him. He played with me.
Gianna's mother, Roxy Washington, says Floyd loved his daughter, and she's struggling to explain his death.
She doesn't know what happened. I told her that her dad died because he couldn't breathe.
But little Gianna does know about her father's legacy.
He did what?
Daddy changed the world. He just might do that. And for more now, let's bring in Alex Perez, who's in Minneapolis again for us tonight. Those 3 officers charged with aiding and abetting murder. What kind of prison time could they actually face for that?
Now, Lindsay, if you combine the charges that those 3 officers are facing, they could face up to 50 years behind bars, Lindsay.
And this upgraded charge against Officer Chauvin from 3rd degree to 2nd degree murder, what does that mean exactly?
Well, Lindsay, there's a big difference between 3rd, 2nd, and 1st. And between 3rd and 2nd, what we're looking at is unintentional killing versus unintentional killing while committing a felony. Now, there's been a lot of talk here the last week about 1st-degree murder, and the state attorney general talked about that today. And he said, given the evidence in this case, he just could not bring forth that charge right now, that 1st-degree murder charge. Here in Minnesota, 1st-degree murder requires premeditation. It requires the prosecutor to prove premeditation, and apparently at this point right now the state attorney general doesn't feel that's possible, so that's why we saw him today file those 2nd-degree murder charges, an upgrade, an increase from where it was at 3rd degree. Lindsay?
All right, Alex Perez for us again live in Minneapolis. And despite those charges, large crowds of protesters, they still turned out today and remain in the streets at this hour. There have been 2,000 arrests related to protests in New York City alone. But officials are optimistic that things may be calming down. ABC's Stephanie Ramos has a closer look at where things stand right now.
This is now the 9th night of protest since the killing of George Floyd. Thousands protesting racism and police brutality. Hands up, don't shoot! Calling for charges for all of the officers involved. Tonight, word reaching protesters.
What do you think about the charges that the officers or former officers are now facing?
Now, it took protest. It took cities burning for you to arrest 4 people.
I'm so happy. I still think it's not enough, but I'm so happy that we're moving towards change, because a few years ago, I don't think this would have happened.
Large crowds turning out today from New York to Los Angeles to the U.S. Capitol, where protesters lied face down in silence in remembrance of George Floyd. The crowd urging Capitol Police to take a knee. For days, protesters in Philadelphia have tried to tear down this controversial statue of former mayor and police commissioner Frank Rizzo, widely accused of being a symbol of racism for his tactics against the black community in the 1960s and 70s. The city taking it down in the middle of the night.
This is the beginning of the healing process in our city. This is not the end. We have a long way to go.
Late today, former President Barack Obama making his first on-camera comments about George Floyd and the protests.
I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter, and you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog.
And Stephanie Ramos joins us now live again in Manhattan. Stephanie, curfew is in effect in New York City, and as we can see, a storm appears to be moving through. So what have you been hearing about what's happening in the city right now, and is the rain at all keeping the protesters away?
Well, Lindsay, I think the rain will actually affect the amount of demonstrators that stay out past the curfew tonight. Well, it's actually already past the curfew here in New York City. We have seen some demonstrators here and there, but we do have some video of certain individuals getting arrested along Central Park West. Again, it is past the curfew, and just to show you that police are taking this very seriously. Officers are out in full force across the city, shutting down from 96th Street and below, and And for those that are familiar with New York City, that is a significant chunk of Manhattan. But people are still out, so we'll see how the rain affects that. But businesses today, we've seen a lot of businesses continuing to board up along Fifth Avenue. We saw some shops adding fencing and barbed wire and extra guards around Fifth Avenue. So police are really trying to prevent the break-ins and the looting that we've seen for several nights now. But I will say, police said there was a significant difference overnight compared to the previous nights. Again, this is the 9th night of protests. Police said they made about 280 arrests overnight, a much lower tally compared to previous nights. So they're hoping that that continues to go down with this curfew in place. But we also have some video to show you from Brooklyn. We understand there is a significant crowd still in Brooklyn. That is out. But again, I think the rain may affect that. That may send a lot of people home, and that's what NYPD is hoping for tonight.
All right, Stephanie Ramos for us in New York. And now let's go to the other coast, to Los Angeles, to Matt Gutman, who joins us now live. Matt, what are you seeing on the ground there at this moment?
Going to have our cameraman Greg sort of pan around. I hope you can hear us.
We can.
And there are thousands of people packed right in front of City Hall. And this is the biggest, most dense crowd that we've seen since these protests and marches have started. It is incredibly diverse, and it is very densely packed. Now, just over the past couple minutes, I'm going to have Greg pan over to the LAPD, which has started manning the colonnade just under City Hall. And they have been pretty hands-off today, but we've just seen them start to bring out a few more personnel. Obviously, this has been completely peaceful so far. The one thing that is a little concerning is the density of this crowd. One firecracker goes off, or somebody yells boo, and we could have a stampede, but everybody's behaving beautifully. Really a pretty impressive bunch of people to be around so far.
And a massive crowd that's gathered there. All right, Matt Gutman, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And now we go to Washington. The Secretary of Defense breaking with the White House on the use of active duty troops to control protesters. He also tried to distance himself from the decision to clear peaceful protesters ahead of the president's photo op at St. John's Church. Chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl has more now on his remarks and the reaction at the White House.
Today, a significant break between the president and his defense secretary over the issue of deploying active duty troops to crack down on violent protests in American cities. The president had threatened to do just that earlier this week.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
That would require the president to invoke a 200-plus-year-old law called the Insurrection Act. The defense secretary flatly said today he opposes that.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Secretary Esper also said the Pentagon is investigating why a National Guard helicopter was flying so low on Monday, in a way some saw as an effort to intimidate protesters. Esper's words were not welcome today at the White House. The press secretary made it clear the president is still very much considering invoking the Insurrection Act.
He has the sole authority to invoke the Insurrection Act, and if necessary, he will do so to protect American citizens.
This morning, the Pentagon had ordered 200 active-duty military troops that had been in the D.C. area to go home. But after the defense secretary met with the president this afternoon, an abrupt reversal. The Pentagon said the troops will remain in place. Esper was part of the team that walked with the president Monday from the White House to St. John's Church for a photo op about 30 minutes after law enforcement forcibly removed hundreds of peaceful protesters to clear the way. The White House says that was done on orders from Attorney General Barr. Secretary Esper insists he knew nothing about it.
I was not aware of law enforcement's plans for the park. I was not briefed on them.
Today, the president claimed he didn't know about the plan to force out the peaceful protesters either.
I didn't say, oh, move them out. I didn't know who was there. I figured I was going to walk over to the church very nearby.
Jonathan Karl joins us now with more. John, not exactly a show of support for Esper at today's press briefing. What's the latest on his status?
Well, clearly his words were not received well by the president at the White House. I thought it was extraordinary when Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary, was asked point blank, does the president still have confidence in his defense secretary? And the answer she gave, I've asked that question myself of many different press secretaries when somebody in the cabinet is under fire. You hear different answers. This one I had never heard before. She said simply that Secretary Esper remains Secretary Esper, and then she added, if that changes, you will learn in the future. I mean, there was absolutely no show of support for the secretary. That said, no indication that he is actually on the verge of being fired, but that was certainly an indication of how upset the president was with what he said at the Pentagon earlier today.
And John, former President Obama spoke out just a little while ago today on race and police violence amid these protests. And in that speech, he urged specific action from mayors across the country. Let's take a listen.
So we now have more information and more data as to what works. And there are organizations like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and others that are out there highlighting what the data shows, what works, what doesn't in terms of reducing incidents of police misconduct and violence. Let's go ahead and start implementing those. So we need mayors, county executives, others who are in positions of power to say this is a priority. This is a specific response.
And John, here you have one president talking about a specific response, specific reform, something President Trump has been largely silent on.
He sure has, Lindsay. And let me tell you, the question has been asked multiple times, including of the president himself. What does he think should be done to deal with this problem, with this issue? And there are no specific plans as of yet coming from the White House, none at all, to deal with the issue of police brutality, to deal with the issue of race relations. Nothing at all coming from the White House yet on this.
And just lastly, John, it looks like a massive protest behind you. How close are you to the White House?
We're close. They have pushed the perimeter back another block. If you look behind me, on the other side of those military vehicles is Lafayette Park. Lafayette Park is, of course, right in front of the White House. So we're about 3 blocks away from the White House. And you can be sure I've spent part of the day on White House grounds. What is said here is very much heard on White House grounds. All
right. Jonathan Karl for us in D.C. Thanks, John. Next, the reaction from the military. Current and former officials are now speaking out after the National Guard was used to disperse a peaceful protest to enable the president's photo op. But it's the words of General Mattis, President Trump's former Secretary of Defense, that is sending shockwaves across Washington. ABC's Martha Raddatz has those details.
They are powerful images. The National Guard out in force at the Lincoln Memorial with hundreds of fellow citizens peacefully protesting below them on the National Mall. The Guard, a strong presence throughout the city, on the streets, facing off in riot gear with those who have served in uniform as well.
The military in the United States does not enforce local population. That's just not how we do it here.
President Trump's photo op and the defense secretary's reference to America's streets as battle space, prompting rare rebukes from 2 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs. General Martin Dempsey writing, "America is not a battleground. Our fellow citizens are not the enemy." And Admiral Mike Mullen writing, Trump's visit laid bare his disdain for the rights of peaceful protests in this country and risked further politicizing the men and women of our armed forces. And tonight, strong messages from leaders currently serving, the Navy's top admiral.
I'll never know what it feels like when you watch that video of Mr. Floyd's murder. And I can't imagine the pain and the disappointment and the anger that many of you felt when you saw that.
And Martha Raddatz joins us now with more. Martha, some extraordinary comments from former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis just a short time ago. He wrote in a statement, quote, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership." Martha, how rare is it to see this type of criticism of the president from these former high-ranking military officials?
It's extraordinary, and he was Secretary of Defense, not just a four-star Marine Corps general. Secretary of Defense, as we all know, he resigned in 2018 over the Syria policy, but he never directly criticized Donald Trump. He has tried to stay out of it. I just spoke to him a short time ago after this Atlantic article came out with these remarkable quotes, and he said enough is enough, that he really had tried to stay out of it, that he really didn't want to directly attack Donald Trump for all this time, but he's watched what has happened across the country this week. He watched that photo op. He's watched these protests. He said he stands by these protesters and says those looters are just a minority of the folks who have a right to protest, and said we really have to look at this as a country. But really a stunning, stunning interview for Secretary Mattis. I have known him for so many years. I have known him in Iraq and in other real battle spaces, and he is the most apolitical person you've ever wanted to meet. So this is really quite remarkable.
Yes,
Lindsay.
Stunning indeed. It'll be interesting to see if President Trump responds to this. Martha Raddatz, thank you so much. And that was Martha earlier today. We now go live to Rachel Scott, who joins us just outside of the White House. So, Rachel, the curfew has been pushed back to 11 o'clock at night in Washington. The protesters are still out there in full force. What's the mood now?
Lindsay, thousands of young protesters are gathered behind me. Come take a walk with me. Take a look here. This is what democracy looks like. That is what they are chanting. We are just about 2 or 3 blocks away from the White House, about 1 block away from Lafayette Park. The police and officials have pushed back the perimeter a little bit here. This is as close as any of these protesters will be able to get. But as you can see, these are young people that are coming out in force here. They say they want to send a message. And I caught up with the mayor earlier. Mayor Muriel Bowser stopped by to show her support to these protesters. These protesters did chant to drop the curfew. They want to be out here. They say they want to do so peacefully. And many of them that have stepped up to be leaders here want to take these protests back. They know that certain sections, certain days of these protests have turned violent. They want to keep the peace here. They want to send their message. And so far, so good here. We have seen it be a very peaceful protest, but they're still demanding justice, and they're fighting for change, Lindsay.
And this is what democracy looks like. Now, you've also been speaking with protesters today. Now, with news of these new arrests, do they plan to go home, or they're staying for the long haul?
They are in this for the long haul, Lindsay, and tonight is any indication of that. We saw thousands of people here taking a knee right in front of the White House a little earlier. Something that's also interesting is that we're seeing new faces. A lot of the people that I spoke with today said that this is their first day out. They were not here any other day of the week, but they felt like they wanted to come out because they feel like this movement is expanding. Earlier today, these young protesters were marching on the Capitol, and their message to those lawmakers were, get behind us or we will vote you out. Today, they're here at the White House again tonight, sending a message to the president that they want to see change. They want their message heard. And then also allies are stepping up. I just spoke with a few white young Americans who brought their van out. They're passing out free water, free snacks. They said they don't feel comfortable being on the front lines like some of the protesters all the way up here, but they feel like they can play in the outfield. They feel like they can help contribute and keep the wheels moving. And they say they recognize their privilege. They want to get behind this movement. They want to make change. And they say the only way that that change is going to happen is if they are all in this together, Lindsay.
It appears that they are indeed. Rachel Scott in Washington for us again tonight. Thanks so much for your reporting, Rachel, and please stay safe. And joining us now, South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott. Thank you again, Senator, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. Good to be back with you, Lindsay.
So first, I have to get your reaction today. Of course, the three other officers at the scene of George Floyd's death, they were charged, and Derek Chauvin's murder charge was upgraded. It's been 9 days since Floyd died. Do you think that these charges took too long, and will they help start a healing process?
I think they did take too long. I think it does help with the healing process. I think Terrence said it very well when he was asking for calm and peace so that we could focus really on his brother's death. The family has been clear and consistent that they want these 4 officers held accountable. That is the right thing to do. I am glad to see Attorney General Ellison bringing the other 3 in and upgrading the charge on the first.
In an interview with Newsmax tonight, when asked if the country needs him to express comfort and healing, President Trump said right now the country needs law and order. Do you agree with the president?
Well, we certainly need order without any question, but we also need healing. We definitely need, and I think the president's comments early in the Rose Garden really spoke to the fact that we need justice, law and order. In other words, justice for the Floyd family, justice for George Floyd. We also want to have a country that starts the process of reflection, understanding, appreciating why we're here again. It's one of the aspects of this process that is so important that we dig a little deeper in our souls and understand really not just a single incident, not a single event, but the decades of events, which will help us really heal. Without that understanding and appreciation, it's going to be very hard for the American family to come together in a one unified fashion.
Yeah, you talk about the need to heal, the need for the family to come together. Would you say that President Trump has done enough as far as playing the role of healer in chief and helping as we're, I guess, all looking for a uniter in chief in a way?
Well, I'm sure some will disagree with my comments. I think the president has made strides in the last several days in that direction. I am thankful for the fact that he has been leaning into the need for justice for the Floyd family. His comments about not only the first officer, but in our conversation on Saturday, the other 3 officers is the kind of stuff that we want to hear, as a kind of confidence I want to hear from the president. I heard it, and I think we're now seeing more meat on the bones. I hope that we continue to see that. But you'll never please everybody in such a partisan environment. I think the best focus is on the family first, which leads to justice and then leads to a greater conversation with the American people about our way forward.
Just a few hours ago, former President Obama participated in a virtual roundtable on police reforms, and in it he said, as activists and everyday citizens raise their voices, we need to be clear about where change is going to happen and how we can bring about that change. How, in your estimation, should young people bring about change, and how can you personally help in that process, Senator?
Well, Lindsay, I think young people can continue to be a part of the process. The protest, the nonviolent protest, I've said it before, it's like through the artery of John Lewis. The image of John Lewis harkens back to my mind serving with him in Congress when I first got here, walking through his office to understand his personal journey, his personal tragedy of making it easier for a man like me to be elected United States Senator in South Carolina, number one. Number two, there are several steps forward that I've talked to even this morning with the White House about. We have the Walter Scott notification bill that focuses national attention on police-related shootings. We're working on a George Floyd notification bill that then says not only shootings, but let's go a step further, understand when a suspect is in the custody of the police department and they pass away, they die. We want to know all the circumstances. And then we have 2 other pieces as well. But I go further than that. I think it's important for us to take a look in communities of color and in the distressed communities and make sure that we're offering the type of future that we have in the most affluent zip codes, which requires workforce development. It requires a focus on broadband in the poorest areas of this country. So we talked through these steps this morning, and I'm hopeful that we'll see some of this manifest in policy positions supported by the White House.
And also, I do have to ask you about Lafayette Park tonight. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis is out with a rare statement saying, in part, we know that we are better than the abuse of executive authority that we witnessed in Lafayette Park. Do you agree with Mattis? Was the clearing out of peaceful protesters for a photo op an abuse of executive authority?
Well, I think the facts, I don't know. I think with the president's comments that he had no idea what was happening in the park before he got there, I think that is a factual statement. I do believe that he did not know what happened. I think he went into the park with the expectation that he could do something that provided some calm and peace, and it just turned out pretty bad.
Your colleague, Senator Rand Paul, said today he is holding up the anti-lynching bill passed by the House in February, and the House has not taken up a similar bill passed by the Senate last year. Everyone agrees that lynching must be condemned and outlawed, so why the holdup?
Well, I think a better question is not to single out Rand Paul, though I would love for Rand Paul to move on the legislation. But the fact of the matter is I've led the charge to get it passed in the Senate twice. The bill is exactly the same bill with one or two exceptions. The House wanted to rename it, and that's one of the reasons why we're stuck here. We could have that done tomorrow if the House would pass literally the same language, save one part of it to include the title. That could be done for the American people, another tool in the toolbox to confront racism and injustice.
And let's talk solutions now. You proposed a bill just today with your colleagues in the Senate that would require police departments receiving federal funding to release data on officer-involved shootings. You also said that that's just the first bill. What's next? And also, do you plan to partner with colleagues on the other side of the aisle? I mean, for many Americans, unity from an often bitterly divided Congress, that would be a powerful message at this time.
Well, I'll say, Lindsay, that my opportunity zone legislation that is now law, my partner was Cory Booker. Cory and I spoke last night for nearly an hour on steps forward. We're going to focus on the areas that we have in common, and we may have separate pieces of legislation that addresses different issues, but there are a couple pieces. Police reporting is a part of it. The FBI is already getting some of the information, but I want to make it mandatory. I want to do that in multiple ways: police shootings, use of force, excessive use of force. These are pieces of the puzzle that I think will get agreement on both sides of the aisle. The question is, the devil's in the details. So I want to make it simple, digestible, and done.
Senator Tim Scott, always appreciate hearing your voice. Thanks so much for your time.
Yes, ma'am. You have a good night.
And when we come back, the growing tropical threat, where along the U.S. coastline Cristobal may hit. The football player who tested positive for COVID-19 after attending a protest, the growing concern that this could cause a spike in cases. And when we return, we take a look at how the president has described protesters throughout his term.
Honestly meant a lot to know that the people in power will do things to make change. They need to listen to us. That's why we're out here, and it means a lot for to hear them say that they will make change, that this wasn't for nothing, that we are being heard. Well, my message was that it doesn't matter who you are, what age you are, you can create difference. And I want to show all these young people because it's our future and we have to fight for it. And if no one else will, I definitely will.
Next, as we've been reporting, the president has made his feelings about the more violent elements of these protests known, even threatening military action inside the U.S. to quell the unrest. So we wanted to take a closer look at how the president has talked about other protest movements, both inside the U.S. and around the globe. Our David Wright has this report.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
President Trump has cast himself as the strong man, standing up to the mob.
These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror.
This week, law enforcement aggressively cleared peaceful protesters from Lafayette Park, the square just across from the White House. So President Trump could walk over and have a photo op outside a boarded-up church holding a Bible. He vowed to take back the streets from thugs and troublemakers.
Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
That approach in stark contrast to his message to protesters in other countries. Earlier this year, Trump tweeted support to the brave, long-suffering people of Iran. "My administration will continue to stand with you," he said. "We are following your protests closely and are inspired by your courage." Just this past weekend, Trump had this to say about Hong Kong and the demonstrators there.
Just if you take a look, smothering, absolutely smothering Hong Kong's freedom.
Young people there have fought hard in the streets, despite a brutal crackdown from Beijing. Trump isn't opposed to street protests per se. Even in this country, he was famously and controversially even-handed when it came to white nationalists in Charlottesville.
So you said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
More recently, Trump said there were very good people among the protesters in Michigan who stormed the State House in Lansing, demanding the Democratic governor lift stay-at-home orders from COVID-19. Some of those protesters carried automatic weapons. Trump praised them, but no praise for nonviolent protesters who've taken to the streets over the killing of George Floyd. And Trump labeled those involved in violent demonstrations domestic terrorists, calling for a military response against them. This week, Democrat Joe Biden accused Trump of fanning the flames of hate.
Is this who we are? Is this who we want to be? Is this what we want to pass on to our children and our grandchildren? Fear, anger, finger pointing, rather than the pursuit of happiness?
President Trump hasn't said what, in his view, an appropriate way to protest police brutality might be, except to suggest that, in his view, it's not this. Trump has repeatedly criticized quarterback Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee during the national anthem because of the brutality of police towards young black men.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, "Get that son of a off the field right now, out, he's fired"?
Trump even joked with police academy graduates that a little brutality might even be a good thing sometimes.
I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
So his vow to dominate the streets is not out of character.
I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights.
The Second Amendment to the Constitution includes the right to bear arms. In those remarks, Trump made no mention of the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and of assembly. David Wright, ABC News, New York.
There is an image that is seared into the national consciousness when we talk about racism and police brutality. Former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick silently taking a knee during the national anthem. He had fierce supporters as well as critics, including President Trump, who called him, and I quote the president here, an SOB, demanding he be fired. Kaepernick was never offered another NFL contract after that, but today his message is more relevant than ever. And his peaceful protest taking that knee has been juxtaposed with a police officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd. We're joined now by Kaepernick's attorney, Mark Garagos. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
So Kaepernick was punished for that silent protest. Has anything changed since that 2016 season?
No, I wouldn't say anything has changed. If anything, the hypocrisy is more evident now than ever. I would see Roger Goodell gave testimony under oath, which directly contradicts what he's out there, or at least Joe Lockhart is saying. Joe Lockhart was the communications director at the time for the NFL, just wrote a column for some publication within the last week saying that the NFL made a mistake and that the commissioner was trying to do something positive, which is just a complete bald-faced prevarication on his part, which is my fancy legal way of saying an absolute bald-faced lie.
Former NFL executive Joe Lockhart recently wrote an op-ed urging a football team, specifically the Minnesota Vikings, to sign Kaepernick. Some teams had said that he was, quote, bad for business. Do you think that he'll be signed? Has anything changed on that front?
Well, you look, the bad for business nonsense was bandied about back then. That was nonsense. The Nike ad put that to rest. Not only was he not bad for business, he put $6 billion on the market cap. So that was nonsense. What really happened here, and what is proven beyond any shadow of any doubt, but the NFL has deep-sixed it, was that they were held hostage by the president. They were doing nothing more than President Trump's bidding.
Just today, the Broncos coach was saying that he doesn't believe that the NFL has a racism or discrimination problem. Would you agree with that?
No, are you kidding me? I think my other client, Eric Reed, has called it a plantation mentality, and I think that's actually euphemistic. It's probably the single worst sport when it comes to minority hiring and minority inclusion on the management level.
Specifically, when you talk about that, I believe the players, it's about 70% black. There are no black owners. And when we're talking about coaches, I believe there are currently 3 black coaches in the league. I'm curious, though, the NFL did put out a statement in response to the protest, did not mention anything about police brutality at all. They have been widely criticized. One reporter tweeted, Colin Kaepernick asked the NFL to care about the lives of black people and then banned him from their platform. How, in your estimation, can the NFL at this point make good or redeem themselves?
Well, the NFL has done everything but redeem themselves. They entered into collusion. They settled the case. That's all I can say about that. They then promptly went back to business as usual. They tried the Jay-Z fig leaf stunt, which backfired on them.
But what can they do?
What they can do is stop the collusion, allow him to be hired.
And
that's step number one.
And what conversations have you had, if any, with the NFL or the teams recently?
None. Zero. I mean, other than texting with one individual completely unrelated to this, absolutely none. They are poleaxed. I think the commissioner himself has said they've moved past it. Jay-Z said they've moved past kneeling. I mean, we as a country haven't moved past kneeling. We've got a monumental problem. Look outside your window, or in the case of the owners, look outside your stadium. There is a monumental problem. The NFL represents the worst of it, and it's really somewhat aggravating and galling when they put out some of these messages, or the teams do, calling Blackout Tuesday or Blackout whatever. It should be Blackball Tuesday, as Eric Reed just tweeted.
Can you share any message from Kaepernick, a message either to the NFL or the country at this moment?
Look, I'm not going to speak for Colin. Colin has spoken for himself. He's one of the most articulate people I know. And I think that he has spoken eloquently on the subject. He tweeted out early on that if you keep abusing people and if you keep oppressing people, there's going to be a reaction. At a certain point, you just can't keep oppressing people. The only time that anything ever gets done is when the problem seeps into the white community. I mean, why do all of a sudden are we spending money and doing something with opioids? Because opioids reach the white community. When it was a crack problem, we had the opposite reaction. We criminalized it, and we ratcheted up the thing, and we incarcerated everybody. So the sooner the people realize that there is a problem and that the bromides or platitudes are not going to work, and telling people and having a institutional schizophrenia when it comes to dealing with this, the sooner that we'll be able to do something. But you can't do it in this environment.
I could talk to you for hours. Mark Garagos, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we still have a lot to get to here on ABC News Prime. It is long a mystery. What happened to Madeleine McCann, the young girl who vanished while on vacation many years ago? Tonight, the stunning announcement. And when we come back, the growing concern of a spike in COVID cases. But first, our tweet of the day, the daughter of George Floyd speaking out about her dad.
She did what?
Dad changed the world.
Daddy changed the world.
I'm tired of our people being villainized. I'm tired of our people being harassed. I'm tired of our people being killed.
I think it's really important to show some kind of support and for all of us to stand against something that we know is not right.
We are here because of George Floyd. We are here to make a statement. We are here because we don't matter, and we will not stop until we do matter.
The list is too long. What's happening in the United States has brought to light what's happening in France.
Saying the name George Floyd all over the world. There are concerns, as you know, that these protests could lead to a spike in COVID cases. So we're learning tonight of already one example of a protester taking to the streets and then later becoming infected. Our Steve Osinsame reports.
Health authorities have been trying to get the message to the mostly young people marching in the streets that the coronavirus is marching with them. And tonight they're pointing to Tulsa, Oklahoma. A college football player from Oklahoma State has announced online that after attending a protest in Tulsa and being well protective of myself, I've tested positive for COVID-19.
You're worried that there will be more outbreaks?
Absolutely. I think with what we've been seeing, we are really worried that this might be a trigger for more COVID infections.
In Atlanta, where large protests have been going strong since last Friday, they're encouraging marchers to get tested and are sharing this list of testing sites with demonstrators.
Although most of those people look pretty healthy, we know that COVID could be out there in people with no symptoms.
Experts say that the tear gas and pepper spray make you more susceptible to respiratory disease.
Our thanks to Steve Osinsame. Still ahead here on ABC News Prime, the pledge being made to residents of Hong Kong protesting Beijing's growing influence there. And you may remember this story. A white woman who was about to get married gunned down in a Minneapolis alleyway by a black police officer. Our conversation with her fiance, what he thinks about the protests and police conduct. But first, here's some of the trending stories on abcnews.com.
New charges for Minneapolis police officers in the death of George Floyd.
I strongly believe that these developments are in the interest of justice for Mr. Floyd, his family, our community, and our state.
Former officer Derek Chauvin now faces a second-degree murder charge. That's on top of the third-degree murder charge and manslaughter charge he already faced for the death of George Floyd. The second-degree murder charge is defined as murder without intent while committing a felony. Chauvin's currently being held in a state detention facility.
The other three officers involved in the incident charged with aiding and abetting murder. In Minneapolis, Quincy Mason Floyd, George Floyd's son, thanked supporters and protesters for speaking out.
I'm here reunited with my family, trying to get justice for my father.
New developments in the murder of a Barnard College student in New York City. 18-year-old Tessa Major's shocking death came last December when she was allegedly stabbed during a mugging near her campus. Now, a 13-year-old boy charged in connection with her death has pleaded guilty of robbery. Two 14-year-old suspects have been charged as adults. A potential breakthrough in the search for Madeleine McCann, who disappeared while on vacation in Portugal 13 years ago. UK police announced a new suspect, a man already imprisoned in Germany for an unrelated matter.
I don't have any definitive information to say whether she is alive or otherwise. As from 2011, we've always treated this as a missing person inquiry.
3-year-old Madeleine vanished while sleeping back in 2007. Police say the unnamed 43-year-old man had been sporadically living in Portugal during that time, releasing images of these two cars and two phone numbers, pointing to them as potential keys to unlocking this global mystery.
So anybody that has information, did he speak to you in confidence and tell you what happened that night?
Amid the ongoing unrest in Hong Kong over governmental overreach, Britain's Prime Minister making an offer. Boris Johnson giving Hong Kong's people a path to British citizenship.
And so what we're saying is that we want to hold out our hand, a hand of friendship and support and loyalty to the people of Hong Kong.
Hong Kong was a British territory until 1997. The offer comes as Beijing looks to impose a new national security law, largely seen as a way to crack down on pro-democracy protests. President Trump has now imposed a suspension of flights from China to the U.S. as tensions continue to mount between the two countries.
Tropical storm Cristobal, already the third named storm of this young hurricane season, is hitting parts of the Yucatan Peninsula today. Forecasters say it could make a run north straight at Louisiana.
Because we've got a couple of days and some of the spaghetti models are really starting to close in, and it looks like it would be more of a Louisiana type storm.
According to the city's own data, over the last 5 years, Minneapolis police have used force against black people at least 7 times more than white people. And yet, in all of Minneapolis's history, only one police officer has ever been convicted of police misconduct, and that police officer is black. He is currently serving a 12-and-a-half-year prison sentence for killing Justine Damon. In 2017, she was fatally shot by Officer Muhammad Noor after she called the police to report what she thought was an assault happening in the alley behind her house. The officer said that he mistook Justine for an assailant and fired his weapon. He was convicted of third-degree murder and manslaughter. Justine's fiance, Don Damon, joins us now. He's been advocating for police reform since her death. And just to start off, let me start by saying that we are very sorry for your loss, and we thank you for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you.
Now, just briefly, the night that Justine was killed, what went wrong and how could appropriate police tactics have prevented her death?
Well, I mean, Justine was the person who called the police that night. And so they were looking for a female in distress. And the first female that walked up to the police vehicle was a female. They knew the caller was female. They knew the person in distress was a female. And there was no commands. There was no discussion. There was nothing to say hands up, back up. It was just a shot was fired. That's clearly what went wrong.
And in a press conference today, Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison said that it's difficult to convict a police officer. Was that something that you were told when you were seeking justice for Justine? And should that be the case in the case of George Floyd?
Well, I mean, I think as the Floyd family goes through this, they're going to learn a lot about the prosecution of police. And I know that that is a high burden. It's a difficult challenge for courts to do that, which is why so many officers who have been charged or not even charged, it's because of that burden, that reasonableness, what's reasonable. And I say what's reasonable and what's necessary. And I think that certainly in the case of George Floyd, that there was it's completely unreasonable and unnecessary in what happened.
Would you say that you've observed personally a difference in how the case of your fiance was handled versus George Floyd? And what role do you believe that race, if any role, has played in all of this? Do you think that justice in your case may have been harder, for example, if your fiance was black?
I can't speculate. I've been asked that question before. I don't know. There's no way to really know. But I can say that how the cases have been handled differently so far, and I'm pleased, is that they have charged now the 4 officers within a week of this happening. Muhammad Noor was charged 8 months after he shot and killed Justine. So there's certainly one difference there. The cases, albeit our use of force and excessive use of force, they are certainly different.
Yeah, they are different, to be sure. And you were advocating for police reform in Minneapolis way before George Floyd's death. What did you ask for, and were any of your demands met?
You know, I have over and over, I've asked for a full accounting of what happened that night. And not just that night, but what led up to it. What was in terms of the hiring, who was hired, how are they qualified, how are they assessed, the training, how are they trained, what sort of de-escalation techniques were used. I have asked for information not just on what happened, but what we can do to improve it going forward. Certainly in supervision. We saw an abysmal failure of supervision in the Minneapolis Police Department, and it was on display during that court case. I've also asked for them to do full review of just the overall police culture. There's in that case, there was the entire police force was on display for them to see how they interact in this, what's called the blue wall of silence. And I'm not saying that all the officers were culpable in that case, but there certainly was a culture on display that can be learned from. And so what I've asked for is that there are cities that have done a much better job of going in and reviewing an incident, a tragic, deadly incident of use of force, and done a full accounting and review of that, made recommendations, and implemented those recommendations and were measured based on what was recommended. And I want to say Toronto, Canada is a great example. I think that when we look to other jurisdictions that have success with police transformation, we need to look to those communities so that we can learn. Success leaves clues. And in Toronto, Canada, there was a full report done of a use of force shooting in 2013. And from that, they have transformed use of force within the police there in Toronto. Camden, New Jersey is another example of community policing. There are just several examples in this country that we can look to where I think they have made changes that are necessary.
I have one just more speculative question for you. You mentioned de-escalation there as something that you were asking for. If authorities had listened and made those reforms, do you think there's any chance that perhaps George Floyd's death could have been prevented?
Absolutely. Absolutely was this death preventable. Without a doubt. Had there been not just the training, but the vision that Rondo in this city has laid out, had they trained to that, continue to reinforce that, we all look at this. Anyone who watches that videotape of George Floyd knows that this was completely preventable. And so much of that was in de-escalation, sitting on a handcuffed man for 8 minutes. That's just ridiculous.
And just last question for you. What's your message to George Floyd's family now?
I just want to say how truly sorry I am that George Floyd's family and friends are walking through another tragic, unnecessary, excessive use of force death in the city of Minneapolis. I am so sorry. And I just want to tell them that I know their pain, and I want them to know that just allow people to hold them, allow people to support them. This is a long journey. It's a long journey. And I'm happy to be a resource for anyone in that family, to guide them, just to support them. And I want them to know that from my own wisdom and my own experience, it's to rely on their faith at this time, because we cannot make sense of what happened. It's senseless, and you won't find any reason as to why this happened. And so it's at those times that I found I had to turn to faith to find any sense of peace in any of this.
Don, we thank you so much for your time and for talking with us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
While protests have engulfed major cities across the country, Americans are also taking to the streets in small towns as well, raising their voices to call for change. ABC's Trevor Ault has this story.
For days now, we have seen the staggering crowds, thousands of people in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, demanding justice for George Floyd and, in a far larger sense, an end to police brutality directed at Black Americans. But the gravity of the moment and the magnitude of the response stretches far beyond America's major metropolises into countless communities of every size, demographic, or political leaning.
George Floyd!
In Mount Vernon, Ohio, population 16,700 people marching through their rural streets. A moment of silence in Carrollton, Georgia. A sea of fists raised as demonstrators collectively take a knee. In DuQuoin, Illinois, Nicholas Tate started a one-man protest, just him and a sign, until one by one drivers stopped to join in. And out west in Oregon's conservative Rogue Valley, passionate demonstrators weaving their way through Medford. But while these protests may be smaller in scale, they are not always without conflict. In Upland, California, activists in a heated face-to-face confrontation, one man pulling an assault rifle from his truck. In Salt Lake City, this man confronting protesters in the street with a bow and arrow. A crowd then swarming in, attacking with skateboards and their fists. But those moments of violence are outliers in what have been overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, though protesters are certainly angry about the situation they're confronting. And while the death of George Floyd may have been the match that sparked this massive mobilization, so many communities are already reckoning with their own tragedies, and the outcry for justice is personal. Georgia is still reeling from the death of 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot and killed while jogging in February. 3 men, including a former law enforcement officer, now charged with his murder.
He was just jogging, and his life shouldn't have ended the way that it ended.
In Texas, both Botham Jean and Tatiana Jefferson were shot and killed by police officers, one of them off duty, in 2018 and 2019, both victims unarmed inside their own homes. And in Louisville, Kentucky, tensions in the city are beyond their boiling point. In March, Breonna Taylor was killed inside her apartment after police served a no-knock warrant. She was shot at least 8 times in their exchange of gunfire with her boyfriend. 3 officers involved now reassigned pending an investigation, but they have not been fired. On Friday, as Louisville demonstrations picked up steam, a police officer captured on video firing pepper balls at a local news crew.
Are you okay?
I'm getting shot! I'm getting...
Katie, are you okay?
Rubber bullets, it's okay. It's those pepper bullets. It's those pepper bullets.
Who are they aiming that at?
Nice shooting at the photographer.
At us, like directly at us.
Then early Monday morning, police confronted a large crowd when they say someone started shooting at them, so they returned fire, killing restaurant owner David McAtee, a staple of the neighborhood whose family said he often gave free meals. His mother devastated.
When a mother loses a child, piece of you goes along right with that child.
Louisville police now say video shows McAtee firing a weapon the night he was killed, though the mayor has already fired the police chief after finding the officers involved did not activate their body cameras.
This type of institutional failure will not be tolerated.
And as the sun sets on another day in America, protesters in every corner of the country are at their breaking point, many insisting that in a nation founded on the backs of slaves, racism is not just an open wound. Its continued existence is inherently American.
I don't agree with all of the foolishness that's been going on, but this is years and generations and decades and centuries of compounded racism, and it's like, how much can we take?
Now communities large and small are confronting that reality, a systemic problem that's deeply personal, nationwide, yet homegrown, and all too often at Black Americans' front door. For ABC News Live, I'm Trevor Ault.
Of course, these protests have been about George Floyd's death, but they also have been about the black men and women who lost their lives well before this and the systemic racism in America. New media founder Roland Martin is here now for more on what led to this moment and where we are headed. Roland, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So as you know, 3 additional officers were charged in relation to George Floyd's death today, and Officer Chauvin's murder charge was also upgraded. But is it too little too late? Or do you think that the protesters are going to continue to crowd the streets?
Yes, the protests will continue because it's not just about the officers who killed George Floyd. It is about how America refuses to deal with how we handle police. Perfect example, yesterday, Governor Andrew Cuomo criticizes police in New York for their response. What happens? The chief gets upset, goes off. You owe us an apology. He comes out today. Oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't talking about the officers. I was talking about the supervisors. The problem we have in this country is that you don't know who runs cities. Is it the elected officials or is it the cops? And so they seem to be untouchable. Look at Atlanta. The chief came out today and said at the firing of the 6 officers who were involved in the grabbing of the black students from Morehouse and Spelman, oh, they were political. Wait a minute, did you not see the video, the body camera video? And so people are fed up with how people are so afraid to challenge rogue cops. That's the problem in this country. You do not have enough accountability when it comes to police.
But for people who are looking at the protesters and they say, wow, this is all because of George Floyd, give us a snapshot of how we got to this moment.
It's not because of George Floyd. First of all, the people who are sitting here don't realize that the modern day police departments were born out of slave patrols. People don't understand, where did the Second Amendment come from? That was born out of what? Giving folks protections in terms of exactly what? In terms of guarding people, okay? Going back to how the Constitution was created. How did people in the South during the slavery utilize these same laws to target African Americans? So now you go through the years, this tension that has existed between black folks and police departments, this is not new. This goes back to the 1800s and the 1900s. Even when you go through the era of Jim Crow, when you go back to most race riots in the 20th century, nearly all race riots were preceded or ignited by cases of police brutality. We can go on and on and on. In King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 1963, he references police brutality. In his book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here?, which every person should have a copy of. In this book, this was a response to the race riots in '67. He talks about police brutality, economic injustice. And so the people who somehow think this is new have been in denial. In Philadelphia, they tore down the statue of Frank Rizzo. They took it down because folks had defaced it. Why? This was you put up a statue of a man who was the mayor for 8 years, who had one of the most brutal police departments in American history. He was the northern version of Bull Connor, and there was a statue in his honor. That's what people are tired of. Centuries, decades of police brutality and them simply being unaccounted for.
You've, of course, been an outspoken critic of President Trump's, especially when it comes to his recent responses to police brutality and protesting. What should leaders be doing right now to unite Americans? And let me also pose the title of the book that's in your hand back to you. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, look, here's the deal that you're dealing with right now. It has to be massive. It has to be a response from a federal government, state governments, and local government. And so when you talk about federal government, you have to strip these departments, these police officers, of this blanket protection. You have these states that have Bill of Rights, where pretty much how things are guaranteed. Even in Minneapolis, you already have the police union saying, wait a minute, they didn't get their full rights. You were not supposed to fire them after a certain period of time. People don't even understand, Lindsay. If there are rules out there that where if a cop is engaged in wrongdoing, even a shooting, they don't have to immediately give a statement. They can wait 3, 4, 5 days. In some cases, they have the right to actually go and look at the body camera footage before they give a statement. Until the law was changed last year, in the state of Georgia, a police officer had the right to sit in grand jury proceedings. Those are supposed to be private. And so think about it. Lindsay, you're going to go testify against a police officer in the grand jury. If it was Roland involved, Roland can't sit in. But if it was a police officer, he or she gets to sit there and watch you testify. That's grossly intimidating. There has to be massive change to the laws in this country and also changing these contracts. These cities are also negotiating. People have no idea that the law is simply set up to where they can do whatever they want. And when it comes to deadly force, all they have to say is, my life was in danger. Guess who said that? Joe Serpico, who took down the New York Police Department. We have a fundamental problem with how we look at police in this country. Am I saying all cops are bad? Nope. But what I am saying is there has to be fundamental changes from the city, the county, the state, and the federal level. It's a whole bunch of work to do, and the public is saying enough is enough.
What's the first reform? What's the first change that you would make?
Well, it all depends on what level it is. And so right now you have Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, as Joe Biden alluded to in his speech the other day, who's working on a massive police accountability bill. That needs to be moving on the federal level. Then you need to have, in all of these state legislatures, you need to be having things moving in those places as well. Then you must have these mayors and city councils and city managers redefining, use of force laws and procedures. And also, here's one of the deals. Louisville, David McAdee, black guy, barbecue owner, was shot and killed by the cops in Louisville. Guess what? The mayor fired the police chief because none of the cops had their body cameras on. I have long said, if a police officer turns off their dash cam video, automatically being fired. If they don't turn on their body cameras, automatically fired. If a police officer lies on a police report, automatically fired. I had the Fulton County DA, Paul Howard, on my show yesterday. He told me that in that video they shot grabbing the kids out, one of the officers pulled a gun out and they caught it on body cam. Another officer said, put that down. The guy who pulled the gun out, later, the officer said, why'd you pull your gun out? This is exactly what he told the officer. Because they flashed guns at us. The two students, not a single gun was in the car. We know from Laquan McDonald, Lindsay, how the cops lied about Laquan McDonald, how they lied about how he did it. And you know what they did? The other cops then lied. And so in Chicago, a judge excoriated the cops and also the police oversight board because he said, I know cops have sat on my witness stand and lied on the stand. You cannot reward people who don't tell the truth. If you and I lie on a police report, we can be brought up on charges. If you're a cop, you get off scot-free. All those things must be happening at the same time. It can't be federal here, then we'll get to it. No, it has to be federal moving, state moving, county moving, city moving, and departments moving. We must have a complete reformation of how we deal with law enforcement in the United States, because this is not just a big city issue and an issue here, issue there. This is widespread across America.
Roland Martin, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. The studies show that black parents often talk about race much more often than white parents do. But in this current climate, parents of all races are trying to craft the words to explain what is playing out in our streets to the youngest among us. The conversations, while uncomfortable, seem to be becoming more necessary these days. Our Deborah Roberts, a mother herself, talked with other mothers, both black and white, who want to help their children not only stay safe, but be and do better.
A final cry on George Floyd's lips, a call for his mother, unleashing a plaintive call to action and reflection for mothers all over the country.
It was gut-wrenching. As a mother of a 20-year-old son and the mother of a 7-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, 3 black children, to hear someone who knew that it was his final moments call out for his mother, it touched upon every fear that I have as a parent of black children.
I think as a mom, and to hear a guy say mama, I couldn't take it. I couldn't even go beyond that. It just, there's something, you know, I think about that visceral cry for your mother.
You know, you as a mother, you really hope that your children don't outgrow their need for you. And a grown black man, in the moment that he knew he needed someone, he wanted his mom. Your kids don't outgrow that need for you.
Chelsea Dort, mom of 4, including 3 biracial children with her Haitian American husband.
Not something I ever thought I would need to prepare to deal with.
We connected with her and 3 other moms from across the country, all different upbringings, all pained by conversations they've had or will have with their sons and daughters.
We can have hard discussions, but this is the safest place to do that, is our home.
Twyla Dang lives just miles away from where George Floyd took his last breath. A mom of 3, her son's almost 17.
All of it hits so close to home for us.
Karen Fleshman, a mom of 2 from San Francisco who preferred not showing her children's faces.
We are responsible for the education that we give our children.
She vows to educate her Asian American son and daughter in a way she never was.
Everything I had learned about race and racism growing up was harmful and inaccurate, and I was part of the problem.
Crystal McCrary McGuire worries about her daughter and 2 sons. 20-year-old Cole is hoping to be drafted by an NBA team this summer.
There's something about Black bodies and Black skin that too many, not all, but too many people in society that is viewed as a threat.
An idea so potent, so gut-wrenching, one mom took to social media.
I dare you. Ask yourself, when did my baby become a threat to you?
When I cried, when I laughed for joy, when I played with my toy gun.
When I wear a mask to protect you and myself.
When did my baby become a threat to you?
When I was born.
Well, I'd like to talk directly, if I could, to white mothers. I hope you are hearing these Black mothers' pain. Only we, white mothers, can heal this Black mother's pain by raising better white children.
Chelsea says images like these break her.
When my jeans were too baggy.
Chelsea, what about this moment in time has changed anything in you, if it has at all?
My children will identify as mostly Black. They will, someday my 5-year-old won't have like a tiny 5-year-old face anymore. And he's not gonna have like tiny little hands. Like he's gonna be a grown man.
A brown man in America.
Yeah. And he's going to be someone that people are afraid of. What I can do as a white mother to brown children that are growing up in America and how I can support them.
Conversations that may be awkward and uncomfortable, but as Karen warns, vital to help value and possibly save a life.
I'm worried, but I'm very hopeful. And this is a long overdue reckoning. And young people waking up and saying, we are not putting up with this anymore. There's so much work to be done. I'm tired, but I know it's a marathon, not a sprint.
I feel terrified and a little overwhelmed, but I am grateful for the opportunity for me to grow and be better.
I feel anger and frustration, but I also feel like this is a call to action where the truth will rise to the top. And I do believe that we are on the side of the truth.
What a necessary conversation. We are joined now live by Deborah Roberts. Deb, we both have sons. Talk to me about what this experience has been like for you.
Well, it's been difficult, Lindsay, as I'm sure it has been for you and your little guy, too. My son is 17. I think like any parent, I've tried to shield him from the harshness of the world, the rough edges of the world. I think we all try. We've had conversations, of course, before. We've had the talk when he started riding the subway by himself, and it broke my heart. I'm going to be honest with you. I cried for a couple of days after sort of talking with him about how he needed to comport himself and, you know, just that the world sees him a little differently. We don't talk about it a whole lot, but I have to say that this has brought it a lot more to the surface. He absolutely does not like to see any of those images of George Floyd, and they're very upsetting to him. So it's been difficult because I think he feels it deeply, and I'm just trying to get him to talk a little bit about his feelings.
Right, understandably upsettable for any of us at any age. But I understand a lot of non-Black moms have also reached out to you about their conversations. What are you hearing from them?
Well, that's what I wanted to do that's why I so desperately wanted to do this piece, and I wanted to include non-Black moms. What has been so gratifying and fulfilling for me in doing that and talking and being vulnerable is that I have heard from colleagues, from friends, emails from, just old friends out of the blue who have said to me, I had no idea that your world was tinged with this kind of anxiety and fear. I had no idea that this was something that you dealt with. I mean, you're a person of privilege and, and so forth. And what's been great, Lindsay, is that many of them have said, I want to talk to my kids and I want to try to do better and have them be better. And if you don't mind, I'd like to hear your thoughts and I'd love to join in with this conversation. And that is what we need. Joining in with the conversation, not being guilty and feeling guilty and finger pointing, but let's try to learn and let's not worry about how you're talking and what you're saying and is it elegant. Let's just talk and let's try to bridge that gap. And I think that might be what's different this time. I hope that's what's different. And like so many other situations, I think moms might be leading the way.
Of course, asking questions and listening, that could make all the difference. Deborah Roberts, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And before we go, our image of the day, a little much needed moment of zen and togetherness at a protest in New York today. Check it out. And that is our show for tonight. Be sure to stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us and have a good night.